Hello and welcome to today's video on the magical and mystical tinkers of Temerant. So the word tinker is written in some way, some form, 59 times in the Name of the Wind here. And today I'm going to kind of introduce each time that it's used and then read the passage that the word tinker is used in. And that way we get a better idea of who the tinkers really are in the Name of the Wind, because I think they're interesting. If you think they're interesting, you're in the right place, because we're about to do a good amount of reading and maybe a little kind of postulating and unpacking the tinkers here in the Name of the Wind. So the first time that they are brought up is right here in chapter 1, and it is as Old Cobb is telling the story of Taborlin the Great. And so he's telling the story and he introduces the tinker. Old Cobb leaned back on his stool, glad for the chance to elaborate. A few days earlier, Taborlin had met a tinker on the road, and even though Taborlin didn't have much to eat, he shared his dinner with the old man. "Right sensible thing to do," Graham said quietly to the boy. "Everyone knows a tinker pays for kindness twice." No, Jake grumbled. "Get it right. A tinker's advice pays kindness twice." The innkeeper spoke up for the first time that night. "Actually, you're missing more than half," he said, standing in the doorway behind the bar. "A tinker's debt is always paid. Once for any simple trade. Twice for freely given aid. Thrice for any insult made." And so those are our first references to the tinker. Once in the story, so we get the idea that the tinkers are, maybe common in stories. This seems to be a pretty common story of Taborlin the Great. We know it's repeated throughout the book, so to have the tinker in there means that they are pretty kind of old to be in these stories. They've been around for a long time. But obviously people still care about how you treat them because the two boys interjected with their, why you're kind to a tinker. So we have the story, we know that they're venerated in the story, they were treated properly, they still should be treated that way. But then we have the innkeeper interject with like an even longer paragraph about the tinkers, implying that there's a little bit more than just like the message is you should be kind to the tinkers, but there might be a little bit more to them. A tinker's debt is always paid, once for any simple trade, twice for freely given aid, and thrice for any insult made. So obviously that last one, thrice for any insult made, is like a little bit of a warning as well. And so it's a great way to also bring Coat into the story. He was standing off out of scene in chapter 1, and so he comes in to like contribute his piece, and that's kind of how the whole group is now together in the scene. Old Cobb, they all kind of look at him a little out of place because they say he'd only been in town for a year or so he was still kind of a stranger. So we also get the introduction of he's only been here for about a year, the way that they are measuring time. And then we have Old Cobb return to his story. So we get the tinkers brought up one more time here in chapter 1. Old Cobb nodded before he cleared his throat and launched back into the story. "Now this amulet was worth a whole bucket of gold royals, but on account of Taborlin's kindness, the tinker sold it to him for nothing but an iron penny, a copper penny, and a silver penny. It was black as a winter night and cold as ice to touch, but so long as it was round his neck, Taborlin would be safe from the harm of evil things, demons and such." And so now we have the tinker kind of giving the gift, and so that's obviously a pretty fun, important part of a lot of stories. You treated the tinker properly, so he gives you something to help you on your journey. And then we have this kind of storybook for, 3 coins, the iron penny, a copper penny, and a silver penny. So a nice introduction to the tinkers right here in chapter 1. The next time we get introduced to the tinkers is actually with a real tinker. So that's going to be here in chapter 3, Wood and Word. This chapter titled because it is when Graham brings the mounting board for folly, and he talks about how hard it was to kind of char the word folly into the wood that we now know is roa wood. So after that, Wood and Word, after the sword is mounted, and put up. We have the people actually come through the inn, so we have some visitors come through the inn. And one of those is a tinker who is traveling with the group. And so I'm going to read out a bit more from this chapter because we're really interacting with the tinker, so we get a good amount of kind of context for just the use of the word here. So Coat identified them as they came in. 2 men and 2 women, wagoners rough from years of being outside and smiling to be spending a night out of the wind. 3 guards with hard eyes, smelling of iron. A tinker with a pot-belly and a ready smile showing his few remaining teeth. 2 young men, one sandy-haired, one dark, well-dressed and well-spoken. Travelers sensible enough to hook up with a larger group for protection on the road. So we've already been introduced that the roads are bad. This is reinforcing the roads are bad, so they were all smart to kind of travel as a group. We know that tinkers are typically treated well, so it might be helpful to have a tinker in the group because they might kind of treat all of you a bit better. I wonder if that extends out. So that was an interesting introduction. Now, the author did specifically say that there were 3 guards with hard eyes smelling of iron. And since there are spoilers for The Name of the Wind and potentially The Wise Man's Fear, I will be talking about, the Killer Chronicle first 2 books in general when I'm talking about the tinkers in this book. Sorry if I didn't warn you earlier. So, the guard smelling of iron is interesting because some people think that the tinkers may be from the Fae. So, is this kind of a clue that they're not strictly from the Fae? Maybe it's more kind of my current theory, which is they're from the time of the Ruach, they are not mortal or Fae. They're kind of a different entity of their own. So that's kind of what I think. But some people do think that they may be of the Fae. And if so, does the fact that they're traveling with guards who smell of iron mean anything? Just things to think about. I'm asking a lot of questions, not giving a lot of answers. I'm sorry. The settling in period lasted an hour or so. Prices of rooms were dickered over. Friendly arguments started about who slept with whom. Minor necessities were brought in from wagons or saddlebags. Baths were requested and water heated. Hay was taken to the horses, and Coat topped off the oil in all the lamps. The tinker hurried outside to make use of the remaining daylight. He walked his 2-wheel mule cart through the town streets. So just interesting to note that he's walking his mule cart through the streets. There's not a mule with him. There's also theories that the mules or donkeys that the tinkers travel with may be Fae wrapped in glamour from that Florian scene in the second novel here. So just interesting that he's walking the cart. He doesn't currently have his animal with him. Children crowded around, begging for candy and stories and shims. When it became apparent that nothing was going to be handed out, most of them lost interest. They formed a circle with a boy in the middle and started to clap, keeping the beat with the children's song that had been ages old when their grandparents chanted it. When the hearth fire turns to blue, what to do, run outside, run and hide. Laughing, the boy in the middle tried to break out of the circle while the other children pushed him back. Tinker, the old man's voice rang out like a bell. Pot mender, knife grinder, willow wand water finder, cut cork, mother leaf, silk scarves off the city streets, writing paper, sweet meats. This drew the attention of the children. They flocked back to him, making a small parade as he walked down the street singing. Belt leather, black pepper, fine lace and bright feather. Tinker in town tonight, gone tomorrow, working through the evening light. Come wife, come daughter, I've small cloth and rose water. After a couple of minutes, he settled outside the waystone, set up his sharpening wheel, and began to grind a knife. So, I really enjoy this introduction to the tinker. We get this rhythm and rhyme to the introduction, one that, you could very easily hear a peddler or a merchant going town to town calling out, like a very rhythmic call out that's easy to do over and over. A kind of more refined carnival barker, if you will. And so we have the Tinker's introduction here. I will be providing the text that I'm reading out in, I wrote it all out, I've typed it all out separately from the book. And so I'm going to link that under because I want some other people, not just me, to really look at what the Tinker is offering and think about what that tells us about them. My first thought is like, is there anything related to iron? Like, does the Tinker explicitly have interaction? We saw iron pennies before, so like I'm thinking yes they do, and that would influence whether I think they're fae or not. And so I want people to look kind of more closely with other knowledge than just I have on like maybe steel work and iron work. If you notice any theme with the Tinkers there, putting that challenge out, but I'm providing the resource. I'll have some link to the text below. I also want to mention that both in the first chapter and here where we are in the third chapter, the Tinkers are introduced right side by side with the Chandrian. It happens in the first chapter with the story that Old Cobb is telling of Tamerlane the Great. We have the introduction of the Chandrian like right there, side by side with the Tinkers. I just didn't read it all. And then right here we have the children singing songs about the Chandrian while the Tinker is here. So kind of interesting. I know this video is not about the Chandrian necessarily, but the circle theme here of the kids really making a circle that they try to break out of, I think is interesting and something I want to talk about more, maybe in other videos. But this idea of kind of breaking the circle, not being able to break the circle, and this like circular chase concept is something that I think is interesting with the Chandrian. So that will be in a future video. Now back to the Tinkers. As the adults began to gather around the old man, the children returned to their game. A girl in the center of the circle put one hand over her eyes and tried to catch the other children as they ran away, clapping and chanting. When his eyes are black as crow, where to go, near and far, here they are. The Tinker dealt with everyone in turn, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time. He traded sharp knives for dull ones and a small coin. He sold shears and needles, copper pots, and small bottles that wives hid quickly after buying them. He traded buttons and bags of cinnamon and salt, limes from Tinue, chocolate from Tarbian, polished horn from a Ruth. All the while the children continued to sing. See a man without a face, move like ghosts from place to place. What's their plan? What's their plan? Chandrian, Chandrian. And so here we get the Tinker here is quite well traveled and has like rather refined and expensive items. And the trader we were informed about in chapter 1, when Kvothe accidentally identifies this grail, they're like, you know what this is? And he says, oh, a trader came through, that trader that came through a few days ago, maybe a span or so ago, I can't remember, talked about them. And then they all talk a little smack about that trader because of how much he was charging for the basics like salt and how he didn't even have luxury goods like coffee or chocolate. And so this Tinker is coming through, and this Tinker has cinnamon and salt and specific limes from Tinue, chocolate. This sounds delicious, by the way. I want chocolate from Tarbian. And a polished horn from a Ruth. I don't know exactly where that is on the map. I'd have to go look, but it sounds... something about that language makes it seem a bit more mystical. But yeah, so let's think, why does this Tinker have such a great selection of things when the trader that came through by was like not? It seems like they're different classes. Maybe they have different access to items and in different ways. So we learn a little bit more about the Tinker by what they have to offer here that the trader who came through recently did not. So our last reference to the Tinkers in this chapter comes with our first reference, I believe, maybe not the first reference, to Tinker Tanner. Then when the time, so they all get settled in, all the travelers are settled in, things are going pretty well. Then when the time for songs came, and everyone had sung their favorites and still wanted more, Coat led them from behind the bar, clapping to keep a beat. With the fire shining in his hair, he sang, Tinker Tanner, more verses than anyone had heard before, and no one minded in the least. Now that's an interesting introduction because the silence of the inn has been emphasized so much. The fact that there is no music, of course there's no music, has been emphasized. And so now the silence seems to be a little bit kind of broken. And we have Coat actually sing, and the song is Tinker Tanner. That's what he's singing. Tinker Tanner is interesting to me. This is where I want more people out there's opinions. This is where collaborate with me, please. From my understanding, the tanner is obviously a super old profession. And so we have someone who's taking an animal skin and turning it into leather, tanning the animal skin. I've known generally that this is like a challenging process, but I did more reading recently because Tinker Tanner, I was like, let me Google the tanners, let me learn more about them. And so the process was so stinky, it was so smelly, and had so much waste byproduct that they typically lived on like the very outskirts of towns. And as civilizations would grow outward, the tanners would get like moved further and further out. They were treated a little differently in different periods. But one of the big things in like even medieval times was that a lot of times tanners could only marry other tanners because of how pungent and dangerous working with all these, some of them use like brains as the curing process. I'm not an expert. I recently read some on it. So that's where I'm like, more experts come in and talk to me about this very ancient, long-lasting profession of a tanner. And that's what's paired with the tinkers. So it seems like they both go back a really long way. But do they share any other qualities? Like were tinkers a bit ostracized like tanners may have been? Why are they paired together in this song that is super famous and known around all this like world as a super old song that everyone knows? I just think it's interesting and I want to learn more about how tinkers and tanners, or is it like a tinker is kind of wearing, we have myths are very present in the story here, like myths that we would read. And so there's a lot of myths about people kind of wearing hides to disguise themselves. And so is like the tinker wearing a disguise? Is it Tinker Tanner? Because like the tinker is wearing like something produced by the tanner, like a leather item. There's something there. Think about it. Just think about it. That's all I ask. Okay. Now we're going to move on to, there's one more reference to the tinker in this chapter. And that is as the group is leaving. So the group is there. After Coat sings, somebody recognizes him and identifies him as Quoth. They suspect he's Quoth. And so the Quoth/Coat goes to Bast and says, I need you to give him something to help him sleep. He does, and so everyone just thinks that this sandy-haired boy is super hungover. He was drinking, and then he got more, was drugged, and so he wakes up with a crazy hangover, and that's to cover up, like, him identifying. They're all going to think he's crazy. They're not going to believe his story, which is interesting. I just thought about that. So no one's going to believe this guy's story about how this innkeeper is really Quoth and how he recognized it from his singing. And so he wakes up with a super bad hangover, and that's where we get this reference. The travelers left early the next morning. Bast attended to their needs, explaining his master's knee was swollen quite badly, and he didn't feel up to taking the stairs so early in the day. That's because to get out of there, Coat lied about twisting his knee. Everyone understood except for the sandy-haired merchant's son, who was too groggy to understand much of anything. The guards exchanged smiles and rolled their eyes, while the tinker gave an impromptu sermon on the subject of temperance. Bast recommended several unpleasant hangover cures. I think a fun writing exercise would be to write what the tinker's impromptu sermon on temperance would be. That's a fun little creative writing project. If you are a creative writer and you wanted a prompt, there you go. Please leave it in the comments. I would love to read it. I would love to read different tinkers' speeches on temperance, how you would write it if you were the tinker. Okay, and so now we're going to turn to our good chunk later, Chapter 8, Thieves, Heretics, and Ladies, if I'm taking Arledin's advice on how to speak of them. We have an introduction of the tinkers here, and this is actually the introduction of Abinthy. So not an introduction, we have tinkers come up with the introduction of Abinthy, and so that's a cool pairing. Now we don't have the Chandrian paired with the tinkers, we have Abinthy. And there's a lot of theories about who Abinthy is and what his motivations were, and interesting timing of when he arrived and left the troupe. And so this is his arrival, and we get some tinker reference. Told you, I don't have a license. I don't need a license. Does a peddler need a license? Does a tinker need a license? You're not a tinker, the mayor said. Don't try to pass yourself off as one. I'm not trying to pass myself off as anything, the old man snapped. I'm a tinker and a peddler. I'm more than both. I'm an arcanist. You great dithering heap of idiot. And so that is the introduction to the tinker, or the reference to the tinker that we get here in Chapter 8. And it is by Abinthy. And this is interesting because we now understand that tinkers don't need a license. And we get introduced in this chapter that Coates' troupe does have like a license. They have a writ of patronage to perform. They're like charged to perform, in fact. And so who has a license and who doesn't? Well, tinkers don't need a license. Peddlers, it seems, don't need a license. But this arcanist, which we hadn't heard of yet, but we know later is what Kvothe goes to study to be at the university, the Arcanum. So we know an arcanist is a tinker, a peddler, and more than both. And so that's interesting. Is that just how Abinthy is defining himself, or is that how he kind of defines an arcanist in general? I don't have the answers. I'm just bringing your attention to this. It's a very interesting way that they're talked about here. And this is then when, just to give more context, Abinthy ends up calling the wind to help get rid of these people, to help like scare them away from him. And that's when Kvothe sees him call the wind and is enamored. He wants to know how to do that. Like, he's like, oh my god, that's real magic. And so when he introduces himself to Abinthy, it turns out that Abinthy would be a great fit for traveling with their troupe. And so they come together, and that is how we start the relationship between Kvothe and Abinthy. So now our next reference to a tinker's cart is with Abinthy again. It is in Chapter 11, The Binding of Iron, and it's here right at the beginning. I sat in the back of Abinthy's wagon. It was a wonderful place for me. Home to 100 bottles and bundles, saturated with 1,000 smells. To my young mind, it was usually more fun than a tinker's cart, but not today. And so now we just get the reference to, a tinker's cart is something that young Kvothe would think of as very exciting and would pique his curiosities. And that is also how he thinks of Abinthy, the arcanist who is traveling with his troupe and teaching hymns wagon. This scene I just want to point out because I am still currently reading The Once and Future King, T.H. White's The Once and Future King. In The Sword and the Stone, when Merlin is introduced and is then training Arthur, who is called the Wart then, there's a specific day where it had rained heavily and the wart couldn't go outside to play, and so he goes to Merlin and he's like complaining about how he has nothing to do, and so he needs a lesson, and Merlin's like, lessons are for when you're bored? Like, what? And he's like, yes. And so he ends up, the dutiful teacher that Merlin is, even though he's not always having great days and admits it then, I believe, ends up setting him up for a lesson. And that is actually right before, minor spoilers for The Once and Future King. If you read it, I feel like you'll love the book so much that this won't spoil anything. But that is right before he then transforms him into a bird to go be in the Muse. And so, book recommendation, if you want something else to read that has a lot of references between, it's clear to me that our well-read author, Patrick Rothfuss, has read The Once and Future King and has put some kind nods to the book in there, which makes sense because a lot of the themes seem to overlap, as you would think. Anyway, so there's my book recommendation. If you want a book where you're going to be like, oh my gosh, there's so much of The Name of the Wind in here. It's like, yes, there definitely is some overlap in the storytelling, and it's delightful and very well written. So, book recommendation. But here we just have the reference to the Tinker's Cart in the Binding of Iron with Abinthy. Now, our next reference is when we finally switch it up and we get the first reference to the word tinkering with the ing ending here. And this is in chapter 15, Distractions and Farewells. Now, this is interesting because this is when Ben is about to leave the troop, and they have like a little party, a going away party for him, and then Kvothe is saying goodbye. He says, I can't remember what I said to him before we left. I know it felt woefully inadequate, but I know he understood. He made me promise not to get myself into any trouble, tinkering with the things he had taught me. So interesting to use that phrase here, tinkering with the things he had taught me. There's just so much in there. I get excited when I read about that. And we're going to get 2 other references to the word tinkering. I think at least 2 later on when we're at the university. Those are coming up soon. And so the idea of shaping versus naming is what I kind of get when it comes to this tinkering. Like, are you taking the art of, is he warning him not to change what he's taught him? Not to I don't know. We'll talk more about it. But there's our next reference to tinkering that we had there in Distractions and Farewells. Now we have chapter 19, Fingers and Strings. Oh man, this is a great chapter. Fingers and Strings. So we have Kvothe transition out of the woods. Do you want another YouTube recommendation? I like to give out recommendations. Kvothe transitioning out of the woods has always been an interesting scene to me, but I was listening to a YouTube channel called Fig Tree the other day, and she is an archaeologist who puts out really interesting YouTube videos, a lot of them about story. And so her one about Incanus is this book. Her one about Enkidu and Gilgamesh, I believe, has a really interesting scene about coming out of the woods and the kind of transition there. And I found listening to that video made this part of the book even more interesting to me. And so I'll link that video in the video description here or comments over to the Fig Tree channel. I may not have sold you on her video, but it's great. Just go and listen to it. If you don't like it, I would be shocked. I'll link it. So here we have him coming out of the woods, and he's walking towards a city because his drive is to replace the 3 lute strings that have now broken and prevented him from properly playing his lute. He played when 1 broke, he played when 2 broke, but when the 3rd string broke, he couldn't play it anymore, and now he left the woods to go to the city. And he's like a skittish animal, and he describes himself that way. And finally we have a gentle farmer and his son kind of coax Kvothe onto their cart to at least be driven into the city where he was walking, looking probably quite out of sorts after living in the woods. And the trauma of losing everyone he's loved and known. So he's out of the woods. They see him. They coax him in. And they're kind to him, and it's such a beautiful scene of the farmer and the son being kind to him, and of course the tragedy of them not linking back up when the offer was made. But they offer him bread, they give him butter, they ask if he can play the lute. He says, no, my strings are broken, and they say, well, we'll just have to be entertaining you instead. And he started to sing Tinker Tanner, a drinking song that is older than God. After a second, his son joined in, and their rough voices made a simple harmony that set something inside of me aching as I remembered other wagons, different songs, a half-forgotten home. Powerful writing, beautifully done, and we have Tinker Tanner as the song that they sing. Just wanted to make sure you were aware of that. Our next reference to the word tinker is the first time we get a different song, including a tinker. I'm going to give you a moment to think of the song title. So we have Tinker Tanner, and we have Leave the Town Tinker. Another song I don't believe we know, but is referenced here. And this is in the other, beautiful scene. And so this is interesting. I didn't think of this before. We have Tinker introduced with the kindness of the farmer and his son. So they are, in a way, changing Kvothe's life. They are tinkering with it by showing kindness after such a tragedy. That changes you. If you are stuck in tragedy and being treated poorly is not going, that's going to tinker with your life, but so is being treated well and being offered help. So they did, in a way, tinker a bit with Kvothe's life. Now the next one is the cobbler. As Kvothe is leaving Tarbean after his stint as a homeless boy on the streets of the city, Tinker's not brought up at all, not mentioned at all while he's basically in that phase of his life. But as he's leaving it, he stops in the cobbler shop, and this is my favorite scene in all of the novels. I won't harp on it too much more today. When I get to the deep dive chapter by chapter, I'll read it out entirely. He gets shoes from the cobbler. He's gifted the cobbler's sons, that we assume is real, we don't know, Jacob, his son's old shoes. So he's gifted them. It's kind of a big deal. He leaves the cobbler, he's about to leave the cobbler shop. And he says, he turned his back on me and started to tidy his workbench rather aimlessly, humming to himself. It took me a second to recognize the tune. Leave the Town Tinker. I knew that he was trying to do me a favor, and a few days ago I would have jumped at the opportunity for free shoes. But for some reason I didn't feel right about it. I quietly gathered up my things and left a pair of copper jots on his stool before I left. Why? Because pride is a strange thing, and because generosity deserves generosity in return. But mostly because it felt like the right thing to do, and that is reason enough. And so, this scene, just pointing out, is such a stark contrast to the Kvothe that we saw surviving and acting in a way that is not heroic. If you ever think of Kvothe as a hero who's done no wrongs or had no wrongs given, then you skipped over reading the parts where he was in Tarbean. It's brutal. His life is brutal. He acts brutally. He becomes brutal while living a brutal life. What brings him out of that life? Story. Story is what draws him out. First, it is the story that he gets when... Okay, small interjection, and then I'll get it back to the Tinkers. But we have the story when he is healing and recovering from his fever after the midwinter pageantry, when he's beaten and he's being nursed back to life by Trappist. And Trappist tells him the story of Periel and Telu and Incanus and this story. And then he hears that there's a storyteller. Now he's craving more stories, and he hears there's a storyteller nearby, and he goes to get a story, and that's what kind of wakes him up out of his animal-like living. And so I'm just pointing that out because I'm thinking of it now while I'm reading this, and I want to share it with you. Because if you're here in the video, you're a fan of the book series as well, right? And so we can talk about these things. Okay, so that was our first reference to leave the town Tinker, and it was hummed by the cobbler as Kvothe was leaving Tarbean. Next, we have another reference to Tinker in the form of a song. This is Tinker Tanner, and this is played by, I believe his name is Jawson. I think it's Jawson in chapter 34, Yet to Learn. And so this is when Kvothe is heading towards university with a caravan. He met Denna on this caravan. He was enamored with her. Oh my gosh, she has such a crush. And then we have a musician come and join them on this trip. And then he doesn't like it because Denna is talking with the musician, maybe even flirting with the musician. Kvothe is jealous. That theme is repeating. And then the Jawson, the musician, when their caravan is circling up for the night, plays his lute. This is now described by Kvothe. He had a fair tenor and reasonably clever fingers. He played a ballad, then a light, quick drinking song, then a slow, sad melody in a language I didn't recognize, but suspected might be Yiddish. Lastly, he played Tinker Tanner, and everyone came in on the chorus. Everyone but me. I love this scene. I can't wait to get to the chapter deep dive of this scene because it's great. Kvothe playing the music for people after playing for himself, like, obsessively in the woods for so long, and then being away from his music for so long and coming back to it. And then the response, it's a great scene, in my humble opinion. But here we have that Tinker Tanner reference. So that's the song that Jawson played. And then we know that Kvothe ends up asking to use his lute, even though he knows it's a super, not proper thing for a musician to ask of another one. He still does it, and that's how we get the beautiful scene there. So Tinker Tanner, song that Jawson played. For my conspiracy theorists out there, it's interesting that they are going to Annalyn. The two men who attack Kvothe later in this book, with the Dowser who are looking for him, say that he, whoever they're looking for, already gave him the slip. They don't want to mess things up. He says, cock things up like they did in Annalyn. And so the fact that they're heading there, and then we add in this, that Jawson might know Yiddish, which is kind of interesting because obviously we think about Yiddish as knot language, like knots that you tie. Oh, interesting play on words. Language, but it's also a bit of a spoken language. And so is he singing the language? And if so, since Denna's relationship to Yiddish and Yiddish knots is something we find interesting, does Jawson play into that at all? So some wild speculation for you speculators out there. Our next reference to Tinker is two references to tinkering back to back, which is fun. It is in chapter 50, Negotiations. So Kvothe is done with his first term at the university. He gets tuition for his second term at the university, and he has to pay now. So first term, he was admitted with less 3 talents. He was given 3 talents to start his studies. Next, he is charged admissions. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it forces him to admit he needs to go over the bridge to Imre, where he can meet with the money lenders who work with people who don't have any type of collateral. So the Copperhawks, Gallet, moneylender, Devi. He's going to go meet up with Devi. And so he's just talking about across the town versus the university, Imre versus the university, as he's telling us about the trip he's about to take. Here are the 2 paragraphs. Despite this, there was little love lost between the 2 towns. Most of Imre's citizens did not like the thought of 1,000 minds tinkering with dark forces better left alone. Listening to the average citizen speak, it was easy to forget that this part of the world had not seen an arcanist burned for nearly 300 years. To be fair, it should be mentioned that the university had a vague contempt for Imre's populace too, viewing them as self-indulgent and decadent. The arts that were viewed so highly in Imre were seen as frivolous by those at the university. Often students who quit the university were said to have gone over the river. The implication being that minds that were too weak for academia had to settle for tinkering with the arts. Two interesting references to tinkering. Again, just thinking about how Abinthy had warned Kvothe about tinkering with what he had taught him, and now Kvothe is kind of talking about the university as a type of tinkering, but also the arts as a type of tinkering, or things that people tinker with. And so education and also like art are two big ways to influence people. If you are going to tinker with the world, those are maybe the two main places I would start. And so I like that we have those references here, and I would love to hear more thoughts on other people who think about this tinkering nature of the worlds. Now we have chapter 15, Tar and Tin. This is when Kvothe is in the fishery, and he's just talking here a little bit with Manette. He says, Manette was patient and considerate. In fact, he reminded me of my old teacher, Abinthy. Except Abinthy had wandered the world like a restless tinkerer, and it was common knowledge that Manette desired nothing more than to stay at the university for the rest of his life, if he could manage it. I think that relationship between Manette and Abinthy is interesting, because there are, of course, theories out there that Abinthy may be one of the Emir of some way, and so we wonder who at the university may also be Emir. Master Lauren's one of the big suspects. We think Eladin is part Fae. We don't know if he has anything to do with the Emir or not. But we wonder about Manette now. Does Manette, and I always wonder a little bit, just the name Jackson really stands out to me with Jax in it, so I'm always a little suspicious of Jackson as well. But there's our next reference to Tinker. It is Kvothe talking about Abinthy, referencing him as a type of tinker who likes to wander and move around, and how Manette is the opposite, but also very similar. So playing on that, interesting dynamic there. Now we have chapter 52, Burning. So this is when Kvothe is battling Fenton in Advanced Sympathy with Elxadal, and it's when he made the very interesting choice. This needs a deep dive as well, because why he chose Straw as his link, and Fenton his source is going to be his no source, so they're both using blood. And Fenton has a better sympathetic link with his candle, and so this battle is very much set up for Kvothe to be the loser, but he doesn't lose, and I'm suspicious about Kvothe's blood for this reason. I'm suspicious if he has a greater source of sympathy in his blood than others do because of his suspicious birth. We don't know a lot about Kvothe's birth. We know who his mom and dad are in his story, but that doesn't mean we know all the biology there of either of them, or if somebody else was involved somehow. So anyway, here we are in the battle with Fenton that I can't wait to do a deeper dive in. And he just says to him as he's trying to distract him, "Hey Fen," I said, "have you heard the one about the tinker, the Tellin, the farmer's daughter, and the butter churn yet?" Fen gave no response. His pale face was locked in fierce concentration. And then they get back to talking about the battle. So it's just a little distraction here where he's like, "Have you heard about this joke?" It seems. That's the cadence of the line. And the joke is about the tinker, the Tellin, the farmer's daughter, and the butter churn. So if you want another creative writing exercise, there you go. What is this joke that involves the tinker that Kvothe trying to distract Fen with? And then quickly abandon that to other tactics because he thought it was useless. Next we have chapter 54, A Place to Burn. So here we have Kvothe going to earn his talent pipes at the Aeolian, and we have Simon and Willem both wanting to get some drinks going, but then Kvothe buys them a round of straight cider for each of us. I responded to Willem's scowl by telling him that if I made my talent tonight, I would float him home and cut tail. But if either of them got drunk on me before then, I would personally thrash them and drop them in the river. They settled down an appreciable amount and began inventing obscene verses to Tinker Tanner. So here our reference to Tinker is in the song that Willem and Simon sing before Kvothe goes up to earn his talent pipes with the lay of Sir Sabin. Sabin. Next reference to Tinker is chapter 60 in Fortune, and that is when Kvothe is actually visiting Devi over in Imre, and he has his lute with him. So she says, "I tell you what," she nodded at my lute, "play me a song and I'll tell you the truth." I smiled and unlatched the case, drawing out my lute. "What would you like to hear?" She thought for a minute. "Can you play Leave the Town, Tinker?" I played it, quick and easy. She came in enthusiastically on the chorus, and at the end she smiled and clapped like a young girl. So that's our only other reference, I believe, just 2 references to Leave the Town, Tinker. First was the cobbler when humming it when Kvothe was about to leave the shop, and now we have Devi coming in to sing it with Kvothe as she visits him in Imre. So, Leave the Town, Tinker. Our next reference is back to Tinker Tanner. This is when Denna, so our next reference is chapter 62, Leaves, and this is when Denna comes to visit Kvothe at Anchor's, and he wants to leave to go kind of have a date with her, and so Anchor's like, "Well, you gotta play one more like real good song and then fine." And so he goes, "I moved to the front of the room and clapped my hands for the room's attention. Once the room was moderately quiet, I began to play. By the time I struck the 3rd chord, everyone knew what it was. Tinker Tanner, the oldest song in the world. I took my hands from the lute and began to clap. Soon everyone was pounding out the rhythm in unison, feet against the floor, mugs on tabletops." Then he goes table to table to have them do verses of it, and he has them like start handing it off to each other, so that way the song will keep going as he makes his exit. A well done execution of his exit. Next reference to Tinker is in chapter 67, A Matter of Hands. And this is after the fishery fire when Kvothe saves Fella by breaking the drench, or we believe he saves her. And Kvothe is going back to the fishery to see Kilvin. Kilvin brought out a small sack and lay it on the table as well. "These things were also in your cloak," he said. "Many things. Your pockets were full as a tinker's pack." And so that's always interesting, is I didn't really think about the fact that Kvothe likes to travel with a bunch of things in his pockets as very tinker-like, so Kilvin appropriately points this out. Kilvin is one of my favorite characters in the series, and I can't wait to do a character video on him. I think Kilvin is a good person who deserves a whole video. I want to talk about Kilvin. Okay, our next reference to Tinker. This is the chunk of it. This is like the most references to Tinkers you're going to get in the whole book. It's chapter 71, Strange Attraction. This is when Kvothe runs into a Tinker. He was being followed by those men with a dowser. He was attacked by them over by when he's leaving the Aeolian going to the university. He freaks out that they might still be able to track him down, so he goes into Imre to put his blood into bottles to send down the river so that they'll follow them that way. He's then in such a state of distress, he gets a room down there. When he wakes up in the morning, he goes down, he's in the tap room, and he hears some people talking about a wedding party that was like murdered. So a wedding gone wrong. And the signs and symbols around this are similar to when his troop was murdered. So it's like signs kind of the Chandrian. And he's like, I need to go investigate this. And so he drops everything. He negotiates with Devi and gets a horse, and he's up on his way to this wedding. And he's towards the end of his journey, and he runs into this tinker. I'm not going to interrupt a whole lot. I'm going to try to read a lot of this through and let you kind of sink into the scene. But I will say beforehand that it's very interesting where the tinker is positioned. This tinker feels placed. They are in the right place at the right time for the right person with the right things to offer. And that is the nature of a lot of more magical tinkers in general. But this one seems like, you'll see. Like if you have a big object and you need a small one, we can trade the big for the small. And then we'll find what's interesting with what Kvothe does take and what he declines. And of course, those play into his adventure after this of what he needed versus what he didn't. So this scene really sets up the in-person experience with a tinker when you're out on an adventure. So he's in the storybook now because he's about to have a pretty big adventure, storybook quality one. And this tinker sets him up in a certain way for it. And so, a long canter later, I came up over a hill and looked down onto a crossroads at the bottom of a small grassy valley. Right under the signpost was a tinker with a pair of donkeys. One of them loaded so high with bags and bundles that it looked ready to tip over. The other conspicuously unburdened. It stood by the side of the dirt road grazing with a small mountain of gear piled beside it. The tinker sat on a small stool at the side of the road. Looking dispirited, his expression brightened when he saw me riding down the hill. I read the signpost as I came closer. North was Traben, south was Tem Falls. I reined in as I approached. Kethsellen and I could both use the rest, and I was not in enough of a hurry to be rude to a tinker. Not by half. If nothing else, the fellow could tell me how far I had left to go before I came to Traben. "Hello there," he said, looking up at me, shading his eyes with one hand. "You've got the look of a lad that's wanting something." He was older, balding, with a round, friendly face. I laughed. "I'm wanting a lot of things, tinker, but I don't think you've got any of them in your packs." Just a quick stop to parallel when Jax meets the tinker and says that he doesn't think there's anything to make him happy in those packs. What a parallel here. He gave me an ingratiating smile. "Well now, don't go assuming." He stopped and looked down for a moment thoughtfully. When he met my eyes again, his expression was still kind, but more serious than before. "Listen, I'll be honest with you, son. My little donkey has got herself a stone bruise in her forefoot and can't carry her load. I'm stuck here until I come by some manner of help. Normally nothing would make me happier than to help you, tinker," I said, "but I need to get to Traben as quickly as I can." "That won't take much doing." He nodded over the hill to the north. "You're only about a half-mile out. If the wind was blowing southerly, you could smell the smoke." I looked in the direction he gestured and saw chimney smoke rising from behind the hill. A great wave of relief washed over me. I'd made it, and it was barely an hour after noon. The tinker continued. "I need to get to the Eavesdown docks." He nodded to the east. "I've made arrangements to ship downriver, and I'd dearly love to catch my boat." He eyed my horse significantly. "But I'll need a new pack animal to carry my gear." It seems my luck had finally turned. Sellen was a fine horse, but now that I was in Traben, he would be little more than a constant drain on my limited resources. Still, it's never wise to look too eager to sell. "This is an awful lot of horse to be used for packing," I said, patting Kethsellen's neck. "He's a full-blooded Kirshen, and I can tell you I've never seen a better horse in all my days." The tinker looked him over skeptically. "He's knackered is what he is," he said. "He hasn't got another mile left in him." I swung off the saddle, staggering a bit with my rubbery legs almost buckling underneath me. "You should give him some credit, tinker. He's come all the way from Imre today." The tinker chuckled. "You're not a bad liar, boy, but you need to know when to stop. If the bait's too big, the fish won't bite." I didn't need to pretend to be horrified. "I'm sorry I didn't properly introduce myself." I held up my hand. "My name is Kvothe, and I'm a trooper, and one of the Ademaru. Never on my most desperate day would I lie to a tinker." The tinker shook my hand. "Well," he said, slightly taken aback, "my sincere apologies to you and your family. It's rare to see one of your folk along the road." He looked the horse over critically. "All the way from Imre, you say?" I nodded. "That's what, almost 60 miles? Hell of a ride." He looked at me with a knowing smile. "How are your legs?" I grinned back at him. Let's just say I'll be glad to be on my own feet again. He's good for another 10 miles, I'd guess, but I can't say the same for myself." The tinker looked over the horse again and gave a gusty sigh. "Well, as I said, you've got me over a bit of a barrel. How much do you want for him?" "Well," I said, "Kethsellen here's a full-blood Crucian, and his color is lovely, you have to admit. Not a patch on him but isn't black, not a white whisker." The tinker burst out laughing. "I take it back," he said. "You're a terrible liar." "I don't see what's so funny," I said a little stiffly. The tinker gave me an odd look. "Not a white whisker, no." He nodded past me toward Sellen's hindquarters. "But if he's all black, then I'm Orrin Belcher." I turned to look and saw that Kethsellen's left hind foot had a distinct white sock that went halfway up to his hock. Stupefied, I walked back and bent down to look. It wasn't a clean white, more of a washed-out gray. I could smell the faint odor of the stream we had splashed through on the last leg of our journey. Solvents. "That Shim," I said incredulously. "He sold me a dyed horse." "Didn't the name tip you off?" the tinker chuckled. "Kethsellen? Lord boy, someone's been thumbing their nose at you." "His name means twilight," I said. The tinker shook his head. "Your Siaru is rusty. Kethsellen would be first night. Sellen means sock. His name is one sock." I thought back to the horse trader's reaction when I picked the name. No wonder the fellow had seemed so disconcerted. No wonder he had dropped the price so quickly and easily. He thought I knew his little secret. The tinker laughed at my expression and clapped me on the back. "Don't sweat it, lad. It happens to the best of us from time to time." He turned away and began to rummage through his bundles. "I think I have something you'll like. Let me offer you a trade." He turned around and held out something black and gnarled like a piece of driftwood. I took it from him and looked it over. It was heavy and cold to the touch. "A lump of slag iron?" I asked. "Are you out of magic beans?" The tinker held out a pin in his other hand. He held it about a handspan away, then let it go. Instead of falling, the pin snapped to the side and clung to the smooth blob of black iron. I drew an appreciative breath. A Loden stone. I'd never seen one of these. "Technically, it's a Traben stone," he said matter-of-factly, "as it's never been near Loden. But you're near enough. There's all manner of people who would be interested in that beauty down Imre way." I nodded absently. As I turned it over in my hands, I'd always wanted to see a drawstone, ever since I was a child. I pulled the pin away, feeling the strange attraction it had to the smooth black metal. I marveled. "A piece of star iron in my hand? How much do you figure it's worth?" I asked. The tinker sucked his teeth a little. "Well, I'm figuring right here and now, it's worth just about one full-blooded Crucian pack mule." And so before I turn the page, I just want to say that it's interesting that we have this Loden stone up here, and it's something I want to think more about, kind of the different magnetic forces and what this might really be. But it's something that is smaller than a horse and is going to be valuable back where Kvothe is going. And so those are two things that are obviously going to be pretty important to him right now. I turned it over in my hand, pulled the pin away, and let it snap back again. Trouble is, tinker, I put myself into debt with a dangerous woman in order to buy this horse. If I don't sell it well, I'm going to be in a desperate way. He nodded. "Piece of sky iron of that size, if you take less than 18 talents, you're cutting a hole in your own purse. Jewelers will buy it, or rich folk who want to for the novelty." He tapped the side of his nose. "But if you head to the university, you'll do better. Artificers have a great love for Loden stone. Alchemists, too. If you find one in the right mood, you'll get more." It was a good deal. Manette had taught me Loden stone was quite valuable and difficult to come by, not only for its galvanic properties, but because pieces of sky iron like this often had rare metals mingled with the iron. I held out my hand. I'm willing to make it a deal. We shook hands solemnly. Then just as the tinker began to reach for the reins, I asked, "And what will you give me for his tack and saddle?" I was a little worried the tinker might take offense at my wheeling, but instead he smiled a sly smile. "That's a clever lad," he chuckled. "I like a fellow who's not afraid to push for a little extra. What would you like then? I've got a lovely woolen blanket here, or some nice rope. He pulled a coil of it out of the donkey's packs. Always good to have a piece of rope with you. Or how about this? He turned around with a bottle in his hands and winked at me. I've got some lovely Amonish fruit wine. I'll give you all 3 for your horse's gear. I could use a spare blanket, I admitted. Then the thought occurred to me. Do you have any clothes near my size? I seem to be going through a lot of shirts lately. The old man paused, holding the rope and bottle of wine, then shrugged and began to dig around in his packs. Have you heard anything about a wedding around these parts? I asked. Tinkers always have their ears to the ground. I have to stop here. I starred this sentence. Tinkers always have their ears to the ground. Super normal turn of phrase, and it could just be that. But if I think about the wind as a way that some people can listen to sound traveling, we can think of the ground that way as well. I think of Toph a little bit in the animated Avatar series. And so the fact that tinkers always have their ears to the ground is something I find interesting, and I want you to think about it because it might help someone else who's coming up with theories out there. So that line has a little star for me. The Mothin wedding? He tied off one pack and began to dig through another. I hate to tell you, but you missed it. Happened yesterday. My stomach clenched at his casual tone. If there had been a massacre, the tinker would certainly have heard. I suddenly had a horrible thought that I'd put myself in debt and run halfway to the mountains on a goose chase. Were you there? Did anything odd happen? Here we are. The tinker turned around, holding up a shirt of plain gray homespun. Nothing fancy, I'm afraid, but it's new. Well, newish. He held it up to my chest to judge the fit. So real quick, this is interesting. This gray homespun does definitely the same description used for the Edem clothing when they're not wearing their mercenary reds. And so how did the tinker come across a newish Edem casual clothing item, if that's what it is? Interesting. He also didn't answer himself when he said, were you there? Did anything odd happen? He ignores that question and just says, here we are, a declarative statement, and then brings out the shirt. The wedding, I prompted. What? Oh no, I wasn't there. Bit of an event though, from what I understand. Mothin's only daughter, and they were sending her off proper. Been planning it for months. So you didn't hear of anything odd happening? I asked, a sinking feeling in my gut. He shrugged helplessly. Like I said, I wasn't there. He didn't say that. I have been up around the ironworks the last couple days. He nodded to the west. Trading with panners and folk up in the high rock. He tapped the side of his head as if he'd just remembered something. That reminds me. I found a brassy up in the hills. He rummaged in his packs again and brought out the flat, thick bottle. If you don't care for wine, maybe something a little stronger. I started to shake my head, then realized that some homemade brand would be useful cleaning my side tonight, because he had just been stabbed by the men chasing him with the douser back when he was at the university. I might be, I said, depending on the offer on the table. Honest young gent like yourself, he said grandly, I'll give you blanket, both bottles, and the coil of rope. You're generous, tinker, but I'd rather have the shirt than the rope and the fruit wine. They'd just be dead weight in my bag, and I've got a lot of walking ahead of me. His expression soured a little, but he shrugged. Your call, of course. Blanket, shirt, brand, and 3 jots. We shook hands, and I took time to help him load Kethzellen, because I had the vague feeling that I'd insulted him by turning down his previous offer. 10 minutes later, he was heading east, and I made my way north over the green hills into Traben. So we know that in the next scene, he does meet Denna. They do explore the farm, but in this adventure, they also come across a Dracus who seems to be addicted to Denna resin, or the trees. I can't remember exactly, but it's a big Dracus on drugs. And so to deal with it, it's like he would have needed, the rope would have been really helpful. Splitting the wine, that will come up in a little bit with Denna. That would have been her favorite wine. And I don't think he uses the shirt of gray homespun necessarily. And so we know that the tinker tried to give him everything he needed to have a successful adventure, and he only took some of it. Because Kvothe is a little bit stupid. Even though he knows how you're supposed to treat a tinker, he still didn't take exactly what was offered. However, the brand does come up in the next part where Tinker is mentioned in chapter 23, Pegs. This is when Kvothe and Denna run into the pig farmer who has a very interesting old kind of school accent. So I gave him a sly grin and dipped my hand into my travel sack, bringing out the bottle of brand I'd bought from the tinker. I've even got a dram of something to season it, if you're not opposed to taking a drop with a couple of strangers, say early in today. So he's basically offering the brand out as they're sharing food around the campfire with the pig farmer. Another scene I wouldn't mind diving more into. Now we're getting to our last few mentions of the Tinkers. We have chapter 74, The Waystone, and this is when Kvothe is talking to Denna, and he tells her, I met a tinker on the road this morning, and he tried to sell me a bottle of fruit wine, I said. I wish I'd taken him up on his offer. I love fruit wine, she said. Was it strawberry? I think it was, I admitted. Well, that's what you get for not listening to a tinker on the road, she chided, her eyes drowsy. Clever boy like you has heard enough stories to know better. She sat up suddenly, pointed over my shoulder. Look. And this is when they kind of get introduced to the Dracus, I believe, the blue flame of the Dracus. And so next we have chapter 77, The Bluffs. And so we're back to Denna and Kvothe talking together. She raised an eyebrow at me. How many times have I heard that one? Grinning, I handed her the lump of black iron I'd got from the tinker. She looked it over curiously. Is this a lodenstone? I'm surprised you recognized it. And so he introduces her, Denna, to the lodenstone and tells her that he got it from the tinker. Our last reference to Tinker in the entire book is in chapter 88, Interlude Looking. And this is when the mercenary that we believe is the same one, or the soldier who has turned to thieving on the road, who robbed the chronicler way back in the beginning of the book and took his dyed purple shirt. He shows up at the inn, but he seems to be a different person. So we deduce later from Bast and Kvothe that they think it's a Scandenser, but they're not sure. But the other people who were at the bar, the townspeople, are trying to say that this man was just a Denner resin addict. And so, our last reference. Jake and Carter made a point of the mercenary's smile, and while Denner addiction was a city problem, folk had still heard of sweet eaters here. Three-Finger Tom knew about these things as he'd soldiered under the old king nearly 30 years ago. He explained that with 4 grains of Denner resin, a man could have his foot amputated without a twinge of pain. With 8 grains, he'd saw through the bone himself. With 12 grains, he'd go for a jog afterward, laughing and singing Tinker Tanner. So the oldest song in the world is our last reference to the Tinkers in The Name of the Wind. So those are all 59 references to the Tinkers. Some with tinkering, some with the songs, Tinker Tanner and Leave the Town Tinker. And then I believe it was like 26 of the references that were in that chapter, Strange Attraction, with the tinker that Kvothe meets on his adventure. So, Tinkers, give me your theories, give me your thoughts, let me know what you think. I hope that reading out all the references can help add to the world and the way that you think about it. I would be more than happy to read out all the references to Tinkers in the Wise Man's Sphere. If you're interested, let me know in the comments and I'd be happy to. And on a personal note, I love to tinker. I like to make things, and I think tinkering kind of works because I make things, I get in my hobbies in kind of a circular way where I want to read a little bit more about the lodenstone and attraction and the slow circles we move in, because I'll often be working on a hobby and then take a break from it and come back to it. And so a very recent hobby I came back to after taking a break from. I bought this coloring book like years and years ago. They've been popular for a while. And I like this one. It's got these like kind of basic patterns on it. And I opened it up and realized that I'd colored a few. I think this was one that I had colored. So there's a fun little coloring. And I just use these are just Crayola washable markers, or like maybe they're they're Target brand. But yeah, just simple, inexpensive markers in this old coloring book, and it was delightful. I'm gonna find one more. This is another old one. And so if you're looking for a relaxing hobby, remember that you can do fun coloring, but not in like the way where you need to do it all perfectly all the time. These washable markers are just so simple. This is the one I did yesterday. So yeah, I like to tinker on and off with my hobbies. I circle through them. And so arts and crafts are always in the mix. I love a good art and I love a good craft. And so I'm always wondering, what do you tinker with? Are you a tinkerer? What are you tinkering with these days besides Killer Chronicle theories? If you want to continue to tinker theories, let me know which ones you're most interested in, and I can read out and give you some of my opinions on the book. Thank you so much for stopping by. Please do subscribe. I'm a new, small, and growing channel in a very niche topic, and so comments, likes, and subscribes are very much welcomed. I'll see you in another video soon.